Today we're talking about how to build a fair lending training system. You know, we've been doing several programs on the topic of fair lending, basically on how to build the management system. Recently we did a program on conducting a fair lending risk assessment. Today we talk about the training system. We'll do policies and procedures. It's all part of having a compliance management system. The reason we're focusing on this area is that a recent industry survey shows that the number one concern for most compliance officers these days is fair lending, and that concern is well placed. The regulators are pounding on banks on this topic. The Department of Justice is all fired up about it. The new CFPB is all over it. So there is a lot of attention on fair lending these days. And when you get in trouble for fair lending, you know, whether it's a clear case of illegal discrimination or maybe there's just some weaknesses in your program, whatever, what the regulators generally going to require in any of these situations is that if you do not have an adequate compliance management system, they expect you to put one in place. Now, your compliance management system, you know, and again, it's largely your risk assessment, policies, procedures, training, and audit. So we're step by step helping you build that program, and today's emphasis is on the training system. You know, folks have said for many years you can have the best policies and procedures in the land, but they're of very little value if you don't have a good training program. You know, you've got to be able to communicate this stuff to your employees. And you've got to communicate it in a fashion where they understand it and where it's meaningful for them. If you look at the bottom of page 1 of the program materials, we lay out goals for the program, what we want to accomplish today. And one of your first steps in developing a training program is to do a needs assessment. Here you go, needs assessment, risk assessment. What are we talking about here? A risk assessment is a whole other deal. Needs assessment is a process whereby you determine what you need for training. Who needs to be training? What do they need? When do they need it? That's your needs assessment. You're going to develop an action plan to make it all happen. You're going to identify who the appropriate audience or audiences may be. You're going to evaluate training options, and there's a huge range of those. You can go to live programs, you can do webinars, you can do in-house training. So we'll talk about some of those options. We're going to talk about identifying resources. You may have to build some, may have to buy some, may already have some. We'll talk about measuring and maximizing results, and that's an area where what I like to do and what most of the industry likes to do are two different things. I'm not a big fan of testing. Personally, I test pretty well. If I take a class and take a test, I usually do pretty well. But I feel like it kind of distracts your audience. They get so focused on, we got to test. What do I need to know for the test? You know, the real issue should be, what do you need to know to survive in your job? That's the real test. You know, what grades you get on a paper test, who cares? What do you do on your job? So it matters. But again, my theory is a little different than most in the industry on that one. We also talk about keeping and organizing records. You know what the regulators say, if you haven't documented it, you haven't done it. So yeah, you got to have some records. Excuse me, folks. Periodically I'll be using the mute button. I was traveling last week, and I was in the same hotel for several days. It was cold every day. I caught a cold or sinus infection, something, but I've got a little bit of a cough, so I'll be muting out here and there to try to quiet the cough so you don't have to hear it. We'll also talk about setting up a training environment, maximizing your presentation skills. We're going to hit some of these areas in more depth than others. Over on page 2, we give you a list of resources, and these are just the agency's website. So if you want fair lending exam procedures or some of the other things we mentioned, this is a place where you can receive that information. Page 3, we talk about the issue of compliance management, particularly about the risk management aspect. You know, folks, the concept of risk management has always been a reality in the banking world, but examiners didn't even start talking about risk management and risk assessments till about 10 or 15 years ago. Managing risk has always been inherent in the banking business, but it wasn't something we talked about a lot. When I was an examiner, that wasn't a big factor. We had plenty of other stuff we did, but we didn't talk about risk management. But it's a big deal today. And when you're looking at compliance, you've got all kinds of risks, but the three that people focus on most intently related to compliance would be financial risk. If you screw up, you can get sued, you can be penalized, all those good things can happen. Reputational risk, and fair lending reputational risk is sky high. If your bank is charged with illegal discrimination and that makes the headlines in your local paper, some of the cases we've seen in the last year, local bank discriminates against pregnant women, local bank discriminates against disabled individuals. Boy, that's some hard stuff to overcome there. And then you also have regulatory risk. When regulators get your number and they put you under a cease and desist or memorandum of understanding, it's difficult times. It's very distracting. It takes a lot of time to comply with everything that you got to do. Bottom line, regulators expect you to have a compliance program in place that includes fair lending. And the whole area of compliance management, building a compliance program, none of this is a one-shot deal. It is ongoing and forever. It'd be nice if you just did it and you put it in the file, and when examiners show up in a couple of years, you show it to them. But, folks, this is a living, breathing process. It's constantly changing. Unfortunately, it does constantly take some work. Over on page 4, we talk about single most critical factor in a compliance management program, and that would be the support of senior management. Most people I talk to that have compliance management responsibilities complain to some extent about a lack of support. Management expects us to do everything, but they don't give us any money. Pretty common lament. Nobody who's in compliance management thinks they have enough money or enough people to do the job properly. Folks, you basically got to deal with the situation that you have. But when we talk about management support, it goes beyond just giving you money and people. It's also giving you support, and that's the critical thing. I've talked to a lot of frustrated compliance officers over the years. They know what's broken in their bank in the compliance area. They know how to fix it. But they don't have management support, and they have a hard time getting it done. Very often you'll have a situation where you've got a particular loan officer, or maybe a couple of loan officers, that just don't want to play the game by the rules. They like taking shortcuts. They don't want to do all the little detailed stuff that's necessary to maintain compliance. In fact, they get a little sloppy in the area of flood insurance, maybe. Or maybe they're not real good at collecting government monitoring information. Again, the compliance officer knows exactly what the problem is. They know who the problem is. They know what needs to be done to fix it, but without the support of management, it's not going to work. You can develop a checklist, so it's very clear when you need to collect monitoring information. But you've got, that old crusty loan officer's been around for years, and you say, we got this new form, you got to fill it out. I've been making loans for 30 years. Nobody's telling me how to make a loan. I'm not filling out that silly piece of paper. If you don't have management support, management doesn't step in and say, look, we've had problems, we're not going to accept problems anymore. You got to play by these new rules. You've got to fill out the piece of paper, and if you're unable to do that or unwilling to do that, we'll help you find a position with another bank. But if you're going to stay here, this is part of your job. Now the person who doesn't want to play the game, they still don't want to play it, but they probably will if they realize it's their job on the line. You got support of management in that situation. We talk frequently about your compliance program being top-down. Comes down from the board of directors. In reality, it's sent upstairs to the directors on an elevator, and then they send it back down in a variety of ways. You help write and develop the policies and procedures, but they approve them. The board is ultimately liable for anything that happens in your bank, but they delegate. The board delegates responsibility to somebody. So it may be your compliance manager who's in charge of fair lending. They may delegate it to somebody else. But somebody's in place. The board also develops policies and procedures. Policy basically says we intend to comply with all this fair lending stuff.